Okay, let's go ahead and get started, and people will continue to trickle in. My name is Will Hedberg. I'm an associate professor of Japanese in the School of International Letters and Cultures, and the associate director for CAR. And I want to welcome everyone to what is now the fifth installment of our ongoing virtual lecture series, Global Asian: A Multipolar World, a series that invites prominent scholars from an array of disciplines in the humanities, arts, social sciences, to speak about interregional connections across Asia, broadly speaking, the flows of texts, people, goods, ideas, and languages. We are delighted and honored to welcome today's speaker, Professor Brian Bernards, who is an associate professor of East Asian languages and comparative literature at the University of Southern California. Professor Bernards is an expert of Chinese, Sinophone, and Southeast Asian literature, culture, and film, who examines issues of multiculturalism, creolization, and post-colonialism in the context of East and Southeast Asia. He is the author and editor of numerous books, edited volumes and articles, far more than I can list here, but they include the monograph Writing the South Seas, Imagining the Nanyang in Chinese and Southeast Asian Post-Colonial Literature, the article Sinophonic Detours in Colonial Burma, and along with Shumei Shi and Cai Jianxin, the editor of Sinophone Studies, A Critical Reading, among many, many other publications. His research has been supported by numerous prestigious awards and grants, including the Mellon Foundation and the SSRC Transregional Research Fellowship. His talk today is entitled Sinophone Meets Siamophone, Covert Migration, Pirated Ethnicity, and Audiovisual Intersubjectivity in Midi's Thailand Films, which is also the title of a forthcoming article. Professor Bernard's research truly embodies the transdisciplinary and multilingual research we wanted to highlight with the series. So we're absolutely delighted to have you with us today. And I'll turn things over to you, Professor Bernards.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Hedberg, for that very generous introduction. And I'd also really like to thank Professor Hedberg and Professor Juliana Schober, Chan Luen, and the Center for Asian Research at Arizona State University for inviting me to be a part of this Global Asia in a Multipolar World lecture series, which looks really exciting. The lineup looks fantastic. And I'm also honored to be speaking at ASU because of ASU's rich tradition in Southeast Asian studies. And it puts me in touch with my roots as an undergraduate at the University of Washington, where I earned a degree in Southeast Asian studies. Now, although I'm based at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, I'm joining you today from my original hometown of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I just want to note that Minneapolis is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of indigenous peoples, including the Ojibwe and Dakota nations. So I recognize, support, and advocate the sovereignty of the Native nations in this territory and beyond. Now, my talk today is derived from a article that I recently published in Inter-Asia Cultural Studies in that journal. And since the article is already published and easily accessible, my talk will be more of an introduction and overview of the main ideas, key terms, and arguments I put forward in that article. And I'll also share some clips from the two films that I specifically discuss in this essay. You see the titles of those here, Poor Folk and The Road to Mandalay. But I'd also like to welcome you to email me if you are unable to access the article, and I'll happily share the PDF of it with you. And so my email is just my last name at usc.edu. I first kind of want to overview the main arguments just to kind of front load it here for you so that they don't get lost in the shuffle here. And so really what I'm looking at in this article is the role that Thailand specifically plays in Midi's cinematic representations of Sino-Burmese intersubjectivity. Now, this term intersubjectivity might be a little bit alienating. It's kind of an anthropological or sociological term, but basically what it's referring to here, or how I'm using it in the article, is to refer to subjectivities that are fashioned in relation to particular socio-political and economic conditions in a specific time and place, right? So how one subjectivity is being articulated depends a lot on who it's being articulated to. And that's kind of the idea of intersubjectivity that I'm putting forward here. And it forms a nice pair with the idea of inter-Asia and the crossing of boundaries as well. So what the role of Thailand in representing this cinematic intersubjectivity, I kind of highlight two parts in that I think are crucial. And they relate to audiovisual. And the first is focused on the visual, and that's the director Midi's covert videography, and how that videography, the conditions of filmmaking for Midi as a filmmaker, mirror the conditions of the covert migration of his protagonists, particularly across the border from Myanmar to Thailand, but you might also say to Taiwan, or between those countries in Southeast Asia and China, particularly Yunnan province. And so in some ways, the director crossing the border, concealing his camera, these kind of guerrilla filmmaking tactics that are part of his filmmaking world, mirror the border crossings of bodies, of Sino-Burmese bodies, as well as of products, particularly illicit products like drugs, methamphetamines, in the films that he makes. And the second relates more to the audioscape, this kind of larger audioscape or soundscape of Midi's films, particularly in terms of language and the conditions in which the kind of geopolitical and socio-political conditions in which those languages are being used. And so what I call the Sinophone and the Siamophone audioscape being interlinked here links the types of conditions of his protagonists to larger humanitarian and refugee crises in Southeast Asia. And they do this without necessarily making an appeal to state structures for resolutions of these humanitarian crises. So I'll say a little bit about that at the conclusion. I want to begin by giving a little bit of background on Midi. Some deeper background will, a deeper kind of family genealogy of him will come out later when I begin talking about the concept of Siamophone that I'm putting forward in this article. But just some basic background on him is he's of Chinese descent, but born and raised in Lashio in the Shan state in what is now Myanmar. And he has a, Midi is actually a nickname. Zhao Deyin is how it's pronounced in Mandarin. He has a name in Burmese, which I cannot pronounce. It's kind of a Burmese transliteration of this name. It's like Kyak Da-in. I'm not sure if that's correct. But he's from this region. He's the son of a village doctor and a noodle stall vendor. He had a couple of older siblings who, as teenagers, crossed the border into Thailand to work and remit their earnings back to their family in Lashio. And some members of the community in Lashio also pooled their resources to help eventually send Midi to high school to finish his secondary school in Taiwan in 1998. And I'll talk a little bit more about that Taiwan connection later, given that deeper genealogy of Midi's family history. But he went to Taiwan in 1998 to finish high school. And then he earned a scholarship to attend university there. He attended the National Taiwan University of Science and Technology. And interestingly, at this time, according to him, one of his friends back in Myanmar, in his hometown of Lashio, requested that he send a video camera back to Myanmar. But there were some issues around customs between Taiwan and Myanmar, and he was unable to send the video camera. So he decided to keep it and start shooting some scenes around him, create some scenarios. He's never been much of a script writer. He describes scenarios and has his actors act it out. And he then submitted a short film to a film contest, and it earned the attention of the Golden Horse Academy in Taiwan. That's kind of the Oscars Academy of Taiwan. Under the stewardship of Taiwan's most famous global auteur, Ho Xiaoxian. And so then Midi became an apprentice of some of the new Taiwan cinema filmmakers of the Golden Horse Academy and began honing his filmmaking skills. And then in 2010, as he was kind of progressing along that trajectory, he opted for citizenship in Taiwan, or of the Republic of China on Taiwan. And yet at this time, it was also when Myanmar was starting to go through its kind of democratization projects and process. There was a high-profile visit, of course, of President Obama to Myanmar and Aung San Suu Kyi. There was a kind of rehabilitation and visibility from house arrest and visibility in the public sphere. And so Midi made a return home trip, and he noted that things actually in Lashio hadn't changed that much. And he was interested in filming the kind of unchanged nature of Lashio and contrasting it with the political sea change that was taking place in Myanmar. Although he did notice a lot of Chinese goods flowing into Lashio by that time, more so even than in the late 90s when he left. And so he made a film called Gui Lai De Ren, or known in English as Return to Burma. It was shot and filmed in Lashio, and it became his first feature film. He followed this up with a film called Poor Folk, which I'll say more about in 2012. And then in 2014, he made an award-winning film called Ice Poison, or Bingdu, referring to methamphetamine trafficking. And this one, I put Lashio in parentheses because it was also filmed in Lashio, just like the first one. And so these three films, Return to Burma, Poor Folk, and Ice Poison, became known as his Burma trilogy. They were all shot on a shoestring budget. And they, using kind of very kind of rudimentary technology. I'll say a little bit more about the aesthetics of it. In Chinese, they're known as the Guixiang Sanbu Chu, or the Homecoming Trilogy. And so these films kind of, established Midi's auteur, or his auteur credentials, right, along the film festival circuit. And as I said, the first and third films in the trilogy were set in Lashio. But what I'm going to focus on in this talk, what I'd focus on in the article, is the two films that he shot in Thailand. So the second film in the trilogy, Poor Folk, which is called Qiongren Liu Lian Ma Yao and Todu Ke, a longer name in Chinese, right? It's actually because there's 4 segments in that film. The first one is called Poor Folk, Qiongren, then Durian, amphetamine, and stowaways. So it's got this 4-segment film that they have these temporal disjunctures and split storylines that only briefly intersect in non-direct ways, right? So that's why it has this more complicated name in Chinese, but in English it's just known as Poor Folk. That film was shot in 2012. Then after he had earned this kind of notoriety or fame in the international film festival circuit, he was able to secure a much greater funding structure, co-production funding structure for his next film in 2016. Actually, it was next after Poor Folk, of course, it was after the trilogy. And it's called, it's his 4th feature film called The Road to Mandalay, or Zai Jian Wachang, which in Chinese means goodbye Mandalay, right? So there's this interest in coming and going, contrast in the two titles. This film has a much more linear narrative with a fully integrated storyline as compared to Poor Folk, and of course, a larger cast of, in this case, they could pay extras to act in the film rather than just having regular people on the street be captured in a documentary fashion in the earlier 3 films. And that comes into play in my discussion of the covert videography of these films, which I want to discuss here. So what do I mean by covert videography? Well, first, I mean a kind of quasi-documentary digital video realism, right? It's a style that became well known in Southeast Asia, really beginning in the 1990s, but in Southeast Asia independent filmmaking. And this covert videography has, I call it quasi-documentary, because other than the handful of protagonists, all the scenes that you see at bus stations in Lashio or at Wat Pragao in the Temple of the Emerald Buddha in Bangkok are essentially capturing documentary scenes of the people there, of the actual visitors, the tourists, the workers and whatnot. They're not kind of set up shots. They're more just kind of like, in a way, videography. And it's also kind of shooting without government authorization and official license, in which, in a way, the director's camera becomes much like the illicit products and bodies that are crossing the border, because they need to hide the video camera from officials. So when they were shooting the early trilogy in Laosio, they were bribing officials and telling them that it was a Taiwanese documentary crew just shooting a travel documentary, right? And so that's kind of what happened there. One thing that's also kind of to know here is that this style of filmmaking, particularly a documentary an actual documentary that Midi made called Jade Miners, focusing on jade miners in upland Myanmar. That style was, he essentially gave GoPro cameras for the jade miners to put on their helmets and made a documentary out of collected footage of that. And it's somewhat analogous to the type of strategy that the Danish filmmaker Anders Ostergaard used to film Burma VJ standing for video journalists, in 2008, capturing the saffron protests and movement of monks in Mandalay and in Rangoon, right? And so there's a kind of stylistic intersection there. Of course, Ostergaard's film is focusing on a much more known international crisis, where Midi is focusing on a community that's very obscure, right? The Sino-Burmese from Laosio in the Shan state, much more obscure than, say, the monks and the school youth protesting in places like Rangoon or Yangon, the capital of Myanmar. And so when, it's kind of easy to note that, well, they didn't, could they get official license to shoot in Myanmar? That might be more difficult. But they even used this strategy in Thailand. They didn't have authorization he used this strategy there because they didn't have authorization to film at the Wat Pragao at the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. So the camera often has this low position that is concealed so that they're concealing themselves from authorities. And that's even the case in the shooting in Bangkok in Porphook. And so even though by the time that he's making The Road to Mandalay, he does have authorization, you can see the legacy of this covert strategy still being deployed, even though now he can shoot with official authorization. So in this film, the Road to Mandalay, it begins with a border crossing across the Ruak River from Myanmar to Chiang Mai province in northern Thailand. There's this kind of, the circle didn't actually go around the space it was supposed to go around. There's actually a Myanmar flag in the upper left-hand corner that's very, very hard to recognize, almost covert. And in a way that kind of captures the covert Burmese-ness of these characters when they cross the border into Thailand, where they will conceal their Myanmar nationality, right? And so that's how the film The Road to Mandalay opens. And then, in this film too, you get the covert videography with showing, movements from the covert perspective of stowaways who are, hiding in the back of a truck or in a trunk. And so that kind of describes the covert videography of these two films. The first one out of necessity because they didn't have license, and the second one a kind of stylistic legacy that he was developing, even though he had larger funding structures for making this film. In terms of the audioscapes, I've been using these two terms. I'll say a little bit more about what they mean precisely, in terms of kind of the what they mean in terms of the language that's being spoken on film. Sinophone here refers to the Burmese inflected, sometimes Thai inflected Yunnan dialect of Mandarin that's spoken by the Sino-Burmese community on both sides of the border, Shan State and in Chiang Mai province in Thailand. The term Siamophone, which has not made so much the rounds in academia in the way that Sinophone has, is what I refer to what I use to refer to the accented Thai and the Thai language acoustic backdrop that really permeates these two films that are set in Thailand in particular, right? More so than the other films that Midi has made. And so that's kind of the basics of it. But there's more to that in terms of what the Sinophone represents, what this use of this language represents in the two films in terms of intersubjectivity. And so with the film Poor Folk, I'm going to play a clip here, but I want to set it up first. So in this film, Midi shows how his Sinophone Burmese characters leverage their obscurity as a transborder migrant community and their cultural proximity to both Chineseness and Thainess, as well as to a more advantageously positioned bicultural Sino-Thai community to advance their economic interests in Thailand. So in Poor Folk, the protagonist, who's here on the right, Shin Hong, observes this kind of leveraging firsthand when he shadows Ah Fu, who's shown here on the left, as a Bangkok tour guide for mainland Chinese tourists, right? And Ah Fu, interestingly, is played by Zhao Defu, who is Midi Z's older brother, who did migrate to Thailand for work as a young man. And so speaking in Mandarin on a tour bus after picking up a new group fresh from Hangzhou at Bangkok's Suvarnabhumi airport, Afu explains how the airport's name, Suvarnabhumi, simply puts a positive spin on a tract of land that was originally called Cobra Swamp or Nong Mu Hao, right? So Suvarnabhumi comes from Sanskrit and it means the golden land, right? You know, you can think of economic migrants picturing the golden land, but really what they're arriving in is a cobra swamp, right? So this hints at how Thailand figures in the lives of Midi Z's protagonists. They come purely for economic advancement, the gold, but are overtly cheated and exploited. They're snake bitten. Later at Wat Pragao, Afu explains to Shin Hong his plan to lure the tourists into spending more so he can earn a greater commission. Afu says he's going to recite classical Chinese Neo-Confucian poetry by Zhu Xi in standard Mandarin as an affective signal to the Hangzhou tourists, who will be moved to tears by his expression of cultural literacy and affiliation with the ancestral homeland. But for Afu, this is simply a performative gesture to earn extra tip money and reveals nothing of a connection to the poetic sentiments beyond their potential to provide material gain. This posturing actually never pays off for Afu. In the same conversation, after he's not, getting them to buy as much as he'd like, Afu explains that if such gestures do not yield reward, he can take the legally riskier option of working with a local bar operator to procure female escorts for interested heterosexual male tourists. Then on the bus after the Wat Pagao tour, Afu fabricates outlandish anecdotes about Thai marriage customs, which he uses as a segue to soliciting female escorts for his male tourists.
来说感觉到这个泰国的婚姻是这样的，很多人都会感觉到，哎呀，对泰国的婚姻比较感兴趣。那阿富的身上，你可以看到中国、泰国所有的一些风俗习惯，在阿富身上可以看得到。基本上，一个男的在泰国娶老婆、娶4个无所谓的，没有人管你。夜穷。
So I kind of cut off the end of the conversation there, but I'll follow up a little bit. Besides fabricating stories about unofficial polygamy to arouse his male customers' interest in Thai women, Afu also contrives details about his own living arrangement background. An interesting thing here about concealing Burmese-ness, right, is that the women that Afu would likely be able to procure are likelier to be trafficked, undocumented migrants, not ethnic Thais, right? Even though he's creating this fantasy about marrying Thai women. And as I said, he also fabricates some identity details. While Afu's claim of bicultural Thainess boosts his credibility as an authority on both Chinese and Thai marriage customs, it conceals his own status as a Burmese immigrant who likely operates using forged Thai identity documents. And just as Midi's covert videography through footage gained by passing as tourists obscures its own fictionality, Afu obscures his Burmeseness by passing as a Sino-Thai. Bolstered by his ability to speak standard Mandarin and Thai, Afu's biculturalism also allows his accent in each language to go unquestioned among his Thai and Chinese interlocutors. Afu pirates Sino-Thai biculturalism for economic gain and as a shield from Thai immigration police. In 2012, which was the year that Poor Folk was released, mainland Chinese tourism in Thailand boomed. And a lot of this is actually due to a film called Lost in Thailand, which I'm writing about as part of this current book project. So to protect the Thai economy's reliance on tourism, which accounts for 6 to 7% of the nation's overall GDP, Thai law stipulated that Thai tour guide positions must be restricted to Thai citizens, right? So here he needs to shield himself from that kind of investigation. So that to me is the Sinophone audio component. We heard Mandarin spoken there, for example, in the clip. I want to get a little bit into the Siamophone. So in Poor Folk, Afu does not just perform diasporic Chinese subjectivity, right? Instead, he cloaks himself in a local Sino-Thai bicultural identity that includes facility with ethnic Thai culture and language. And this is where the concept of the Sinophone intersects with what I call the Siamophone conditions of Midi's filmmaking, at least in Thailand. And so this term Siamophone is a bit strange, no doubt, because Siamese is not what we use to refer to the language. We use the term Thai, right? So why not use a term like Thaiphone, Thai, which would refer to the central Thai or the national language of Thailand, or Thaiphone, Tai, which would refer to the language families, the Thai Kadai language family spoken by Shan minority in Myanmar, or by Dai, the Daizhu people in southern China, or Lao people in Laos. And so there's a reason that I'm using Siamophone rather than, say, for example, Thaiphone here. And part of that is that I'm referring to individuals of non-Thai nationality and non-Thai ethnicity in their interaction with the Thai state. And if we look at how the kind of Thai state came to be, right, its history of transition from the Siamese kingdom to a nation state, through works like Thongchai Winnichaklu's Siam Mapped, right? We see how Siam transformed into a modern nation state through its resistance to colonization, but which also meant the Siamese state mimicking colonial institutions. And so Siamophone here, as a kind of, if you want to think of it in terms of post-coloniality or coloniality or decolonization, what have you, would refer to the selective inclusion in and exclusion from Siam of these speakers of accented Thai, of non-Thai nationality and non-Thai ethnicity. And here I am making the argument that Siamophone complements the Sinophone audioscape by making audible voices not limited to the ethnographic positionality of Midi's Sino-Burmese subjects. These voices are embedded in socio-historical processes that cut across the ethnographic borders of the upland Southeast Asian region that James Scott conceptually identifies as Zomia. So in his book from 2009 called The Art of Not Being Governed, An Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia, Scott describes historical patterns of state making and unmaking associated with Zomian hill societies. For Scott, Zomia consists of, quote, shatter zones, where the expansion of states, empires, slave trading, and wars, as well as natural disasters, have driven large numbers of people to seek refuge in out-of-the-way places. Myanmar's Shan state historically comprises such a shatter zone, though the Sinophone Burmese community Midi depicts is linguistically and ethnographically distinct from the Zomian hill societies that Scott addresses in his book. Yet Zomian social patterns are not necessarily ethnically bounded, as Scott suggests, but are quite variable over time and usually, quote, encode a group's relative position vis-a-vis state authority. So Scott acknowledges that the Yunnan division of the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang KMT military, and its retreat from China to Burma following their loss of the civil war to the communists in 1949, is a modern adaptation of his Zomian model. This is because of their alliance building with hill peoples who for centuries defied incorporation into state building schemes, and the efforts of their Sino-Burmese descendants to circumvent geopolitical surveillance in conducting trans-border economic activities. So with the retreat of Kuomintang forces to the Golden Triangle where Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos meet, the Yunnanese communities and their hill allies in running the opium trade took political advantage of 4 nearly contiguous national jurisdictions to skew their legibility to state surveillance. The Shan State's Yunnanese Sino-Burmese community was historically implicated in both the KMT and Shan rebel operations against the Burmese military government. And Midi's own great-grandfather had worked on the Myanmar Yunnan Highway, and his grandfather migrated the family, was part of the KMT and migrated the family to La Chaux and the Shan State. Beginning around 1958, the Shan State became a hub of both Golden Triangle opium trafficking and secessionist insurgencies that eventually coalesced into the Shan State Army by 1964. And Bertil Lintner, a Swedish journalist and former Burma correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review, described the Shan State in 1944 as, quote, a motley mosaic of self-made military commanders, mercenaries, communists, as well as nationalist insurgents, contraband traders, and assorted outlaws. Now, this history contextualizes several living legacies threaded through Midi's biography, as well as his filmography. So in Poor Folk, one legacy is the film's primary setting in the Chiang Mai province refugee border town of Arunothai, known in Chinese as Dagudi, which is occupied by upland Burmese stateless refugees that include both indigenous hill peoples and a majority of Yunnanese Burmese residents, most with historical connections to the KMT's 93rd Army Division that fled Yunnan. And again, this kind of Yunnanese Mandarin is a local kind of lingua franca for them. A second legacy is the illicit economy, like the methamphetamine trade, which is a contemporary evolution of the former opium trade, in which Midi's characters become entangled. And a third legacy would be the transborder Yunnanese, Burmese, and Thai communities' sustained connection to Taiwan. Throughout Midi's filmography, Taiwan serves as a destination of labor migration and economic desire. So the patterns by which Midi's characters use a Zomian shifting of ethnic and national self-representation to engage with and conceal themselves from Thai political and economic forces are these Siamophone conditions. These conditions align Midi's protagonists with not just Zomian hill societies, but other migrant Southeast Asian groups like, say, the brutalized Rohingya Muslim minority and others who seek safe asylum and economic opportunity in Thailand, but face harsh exploitation, discrimination, deportation, and harassment there. Now, because they possess phenotypical proximity to Thailand's multicultural milieu, yet lack recourse to Thai citizenship through legal channels, undocumented migrants from such communities may pirate local ethnic identities to secure their refuge and employment. Midi's Siamophone films illustrate this process, right? His subjects shift their ethnic and national self-representation in relation to Chinese, Taiwanese, Thai, Burman, and upland Southeast Asian indigenous minorities to engage in transborder activities and to evade or self-define their terms of legibility to state agents. So in The Road to Mandalay, this occurs with the protagonist Lien Ching's attempt to secure gainful employment in Bangkok. And before she has even learned to speak rudimentary Thai, she learns through her Thai-speaking friends that her Burmese background and lack of a work permit will be a serious obstacle. So she works through a Sino-Burmese intermediary in this illicit identity card scheme to be connected with a regional military official in Chiang Mai province. And traveling by bus there, she meets the regional official in an isolated rural landscape. And by this time, Lianqing has learned enough Thai to understand the regional officials' instructions to make the identity card scheme work, as we'll see in this clip.
เธอต้องท่องให้จำนะต่อไปนี้เธอไม่ใช่ชาวพม่าอีกแล้วนะเธอจะมีชื่อใหม่ชื่อว่าเหมยอีนะโกอิวพ่อเธอชื่ออาชีแม่เธอชื่อจงอีนะเธอไม่ต้องห่วงเรื่องภาษาของเธอถึงแม้เธอจะเป็นชาวเขาพูดไม่ค่อยชัดก็ไม่เป็นไรที่อำเภอน่ะพวกเดียวกันทั้งนั้น
ชื่ออะไร
ชื่อเมยีโกยู
ชื่อจริงนะเหมยอีโกอิว
ชื่อจริง
เป็นคนบ้านไหน
บ้านซบหมาย
เกิดวันที่เท่าไหร่
วันเกิด2 กุมภาพันธ์2535
อายุเท่าไหร่แล้ว
อายุ23 ปี
พ่อชื่ออะไร
พ่อชื่ออาชิโกยู
แม่ล่ะ
แม่ชื่อจงอีโกยู
มีเลขที่บัตรประชาชนไหม
นี่225539021756
แล้วไปทำบัตรหายที่ไหนล่ะ
ไปบนรถเมล์ที่กรุงเทพ
Okay, so in the northern Thai borderlands, where there are numerous indigenous upland minority groups, it would make perfect sense that Lianqing's spoken Thai would be accented and limited. The lack of specification regarding her ethnic affiliation suggests that the Thai authorities are not likely concerned about distinguishing the various cultural minority, quote unquote, hill tribes or Chao Kao in the region. In the English subtitles, when the official says, "You're from the mountains," he more literally says in Thai that she belongs to a hill tribe, a Chao Kao, or is an indigenous minority. When Lianqing, or here her name is Mai Goyu, visits the local government office to give testimony, she delivers complete sentences in Thai for the first time as she recites the identity number she has been given and explains to the authorities that she lost her card on the bus. As part of the scheme, a man from her professed home village of Somai has been hired to vouch for her as a guarantor during the interview. Mai Goyu's passing as an upland indigenous minority ties the selective shifting of Zomian ethnic identification to economic necessity and to the strategy of self-defining one's incorporation into the ever more technologically omnipotent regimes of state surveillance in a post-Zomian contemporary era. You can see through there that the interview, the interrogation is being videotaped. The Siamophone conditions in Poor Folk and the Road to Mandalay are not simply constrained within these narrowly tragic storylines of the protagonists. Instead, their storylines intersect and are audiovisually juxtaposed against a broader Thai audioscape. This invites direct analogy between what happens to the protagonist and the larger socio-political events that are alluded to in the sonic backdrop. Midi's multilingual and sometimes cross-cultural conversations take place amidst the sound of radios and televisions, including news reports, serial dramas, and popular Thai songs, in addition to the more generic environmental sounds of street traffic, nature, and armed conflict. In Poor Folk, during a scene in which Shin Hong, the protagonist, delivers his sister across the border into the hands of a Sino-Thai trafficker, the trafficker shares a cigarette and converses with his Burmese bodyguard or hitman in army fatigues. And I'm guessing, though Midi doesn't say, that the hitman is a Shan or a Shan migrant. And this Shan migrant kind of casually wields a handgun in the scene. Shin Hong shares food with his sister in the visual backdrop and is oblivious to the Thai language conversation in the foreground.
ที่ฝั่งพม่าเนี่ยเป็นไงช่วงเนี้ย
ตอนนี้กำลังยุ่งเขากำลังเลือกตั้งอยู่
เลือกตั้งเสร็จแล้วไม่ใช่เหรอ
เสร็จแล้วแต่คนต่างประเทศเขาจะมาดูความเรียบร้อย
ที่จะกลับไหม
ก็ดูข่าวทางวันเรียบร้อยโอเคดีก็น่าจะกลับอยู่
ไม่ต้องกลับแล้วมึงเรียนได้ดี
อยู่ที่นี่ก็ตอนนี้ก็มีอยู่3 งานเองไม่ค่อยมีหรอกงานแรกก็พยายามอยู่บ้านอาชงเขาอยู่งานที่2ก็ช่วยยงก็เขาเก็บหนี้
ก็ลีนั่นมึงอยู่เนี่ยสิ้นใหญ่มีต้องปืน
ปืนนี่มันมีทุกคนครับมันไม่ใช่ว่ามีอยู่ผมคนเดียว
มันไม่เหมือนหรอก
มันก็ไม่แตกต่างกันเนอะถ้ามันมีปืน
ถ้าเลือกเสร็จในช่วงนี้มันดีจะมีงานเข้าไหมต่างเล่าเนี่ยจะมีอีกไหม
มีเรื่อย
มั่ง
ๆมีเพราะว่าทางไทยนี่เขาไม่ได้เปิดด่านต้องหนีเข้ามา
เดี๋ยวเวลาเขามาพาเนี่ยมึงเอา 1,000นะ
ได้ คนที่มาพาใช่ไหมครับ
นี่มาพา
ได้
ค่านำพาเนี่ย1,000
ได้
เดี๋ยวแบ่งให้หนึ่ง500อ่ะ
โอเค
So in heavily accented Thai, the armed Burmese bodyguard shares his thoughts on several subjects with the trafficker. The recent elections in Myanmar, his mild skepticism over his economic prospects in both Myanmar and Thailand, the lawlessness of his various occupations, and the current conditions of undocumented migration as the local Thai border remains officially closed to legal immigration. Among other overheard snippets of the Siamophone audioscape, such conversations deviate from the primary storylines of Midi's protagonist, but they offer a touch point of comparison that situates these storylines within a broader commentary on how the geopolitical and economic fallout of conditions in Myanmar and Thailand, or more globally in terms of the economy, adversely affect disenfranchised border communities or trans-border communities. Many elements in this Siamophone audioscape, such as the Thai radio and television reports, may seem like improvised or accidental captures during Midi's attempt to realistically document the auditory backdrops in his films. Yet there's a logical relationship between these backgrounded sounds and the predicaments in which Midi's protagonists find themselves. Without being overtly explanatory, this relationship is integral to the two films' audiovisual affect and aesthetic. It produces this Sinophone and Siamophone intersubjectivity that links Midi's Sino-Burmese protagonist to other stateless refugees and marginalized minorities in Thailand. So to conclude, the analogies that Midi implies between the lives of his protagonist and other crises in upland Southeast Asia suggest that his cinematic interest does not easily conform to the neoliberal humanist appeal that Annika Furman calls the politics of, quote, minoritarian injury in her study of vernacular Buddhism and queer personhood in Thai cinema. Furman says that this politics often reinscribes the wounded particularity of that minoritarian injury and affirms the primacy of the normative ideal that they were excluded from. Neither Poor Folk nor the Mandalay or the road to Mandalay appeals to the Thai Burmese or Taiwanese governments for state recognition, for resources, for reparation, or special status for the wounded particularity suffered by the Sino-Burmese migrants. Nor do his films make a similar pitch to international polities such as ASEAN, the United Nations, or human rights NGOs. Midi's ethics of filming unwitting cinematic subjects in the Burma trilogy to capitalize from the illicit industries and idiosyncratic hybridity of the transborder Sino-Burmese community indeed invite scrutiny. As his films have been enthusiastically received at international film festivals, especially in Taiwan, Midi's filmography demonstrates his leveraging of his early shoestring budget productions to advance his career. In interviews, Midi reiterates that if he had not become a filmmaker, he would have turned to drug trafficking, which he claims is as viable and legitimate an occupational pathway as any for those from the Shan state. Most importantly, the relationship between Midi's audiovisual aesthetics and narrative content reveals the director's intimacy with and concern for the community that he represents. His own ethnocultural identity statements reflect the very politics of shifting legibility to different authorities that his filmic protagonists embody. He offers insights into how Sinophone and Siamophone audiovisual intersubjectivity operates in his films. In Midi's Sinophone biography, which is entitled Gathering, Leaving, Ice Poison, he mobilizes his familial and ethnographic history as a descendant of Yunnanese immigrants to appeal to Sinophone readers and audiences, as he describes how his art illustrates the survival skills of the Chinese diaspora and claims that he has, quote, become Taiwanese in his values and worldview. In Anglophone contexts like international film festivals, Midi often positions himself as Burmese, right? Not highlighting his Chineseness, as he highlights the humanitarian crises of drug and sex trafficking in the Golden Triangle borderlands. Yet in Poor Folk and The Road to Mandalay, both sites of homeland identification, whether Myanmar or Taiwan, are co-created by their interlinked Sinophone and Siamophone audiovisual components. And these components foreground Midi's filmmaking access to Thailand as both mirroring and contrasting his protagonist's migratory experiences. Myanmar, which is the site of potential return, and Taiwan as the desirable modern destination, are imagined from the character's precariously undocumented status in Thailand. With rampant official corruption allowing for the pirating of various ethnic covers, Thailand is ultimately the cobra swamp, the Nong Mu Hao, that produces no affective ties, only fantasies of elsewhere. Yet it is precisely Thailand that is the shooting location and setting where Sinophone and Siamophone conditions creatively co-articulate both the Burmese homeland and the desire for Taiwan. Without appeals to humanitarian action, Midi's audiovisual exploration of transborder Sinophone and Siamophone intersubjectivity fashions its own political and cultural agency in relation to, but not necessarily in service of, multiple geopolitical authorities that are revealed as corrupt, failing, or altogether indifferent to his community's dehumanizing victimization, criminal perpetration, and its adaptive ingenuity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. The webinar format is particularly bad at expressing congratulations. We've got a really interesting and diverse audience, so I think we'll have a great discussion. We'll turn over to the Q&A now. I think the easiest way to do this is to use the raise hand function, since I can't see analog hands as in the webinar. So if you want to raise your hand via the feature, or if you'd prefer, you can also type a question to the transcript, and I'll do my best to kind of relay all of these questions. While we're waiting, Juliana, please, after you.
Just waiting for people to type in some responses, but wanting to use that time in between just to say that this was a fabulous talk and I really liked it, and loved the way in which you pointed out the complexity of how these identities are being constructed in situational manners. And I think that your way of describing it, of course, has a lot to do with understanding ethnicities in these kinds of contexts. And I thought that it very well captures what is actually going on, particularly with regard to this sort of belonging to a nation state is less desirable than just using that nation state as a transactional venue to something else.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly. I love that phrase, and it's interesting. I can't believe in the whole article I never used the phrase transactional, but that's what's going on in these cases. Yeah.
Oh, here's Jim.
We have a question from Professor James Rush. Jim, please go ahead.
Wow. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So that was a great talk. I enjoyed it very much. You've got shape shifting all over the place. And I'm interested in Midi and his own identity, because it turns out it's not accidental that he chose Taiwan as his ultimate destination, being in the lineage of the KMT occupiers who moved there after the war. So I'd like learning about that. So do you think that Taiwan is the ultimate destination of his pilgrimage, since these pilgrimages can expand way beyond Asia and Southeast Asia? So if he becomes a famous film director, would it appeal to him to move to Europe or to the United States as yet another destination in his pilgrimage?
That's a fantastic question, and I appreciate it because it highlights the kind of where the metropoles are based on different kind of, and if we think of metropoles as often being fashioned as desirable locations for economic advancement, education, career opportunities, capital, and for much of the Sinophone Southeast Asian community, and of course in my book I was looking more at my first book I was looking more at Malaysian writers and Taiwan being a destination through kind of Cold War politics that they had access to advance their careers as writers while they felt persecuted in Malaysia under the kind of ethnocracy there, right? Taiwan became this kind of metropolitan appeal to the diaspora metropolitan site, and that has had kind of lasting legacies. And of course, it's very direct, as you pointed out, in the case of Midi Z's own family background with the KMT. Of course, most of the KMT, especially coastal KMT, went to exiled to Taiwan, but there is this faction that went to Southeast Asia, in Thailand and Myanmar. You still have these KMT villages, right? And so that was kind of the access point, even though culturally he's, Midi Z was probably more in the kind of cultural sphere of, say, Yunnanese Chinese, right? Taiwan became this kind of metropolitan destination for educational advancement, and it remains that, right? Because there's also, he's also now tapped into the legacy of New Taiwan cinema. Ho Xiaoxian, Tsai Ming-liang is probably, who's also from Malaysia, right? Who accessed Taiwan as a filmmaker. That's kind of been his circuit, right? And so he's really ridden that circuit so far. But of course he's only made a handful of very short films in Taiwan. He makes most of his films in Myanmar and Thailand. He's now made a feature film after Road to Mandalay in Malaysia called Nino Wu. So he's kind of interested in tracking the migrations, the trajectories of Sino-Burmese migrants. And if that trajectory in terms of filmmaking takes him to Europe and the West, I imagine that maybe he will make a film there. Will that mean that he necessarily migrates there? It's really hard to anticipate given this kind of the flexibility. But I think, certainly where his education and now where his kind of linguistic ability lies, Taiwan has provided the landing pad for him. But in the films, like in the first film, Return to Burma begins with a protagonist returning to Myanmar from Taiwan after a kind of failed construction job, which is what Midi Z thought he was going to be doing in Taiwan. So Taiwan is kind of this land of opportunity, doesn't necessarily pan out. And that's the basis from which he started his filmmaking, right? So it's not necessary. So I think he's kind of he's aware that, that there is a kind of fantasy of Taiwan that doesn't necessarily match the reality, but certainly for him, it has provided a wealth of opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, to kind of build on the question raised by Professor Rush, I was wondering, in this film that takes place at this intersection of, Sinophone and Siamophone spheres, where language is, such a crucial marker of identity. Can you talk a little bit about the international reception and circulation of these films? I'm wondering how translation and subtitling either, effaces or maybe more optimistically kind of draws attention to some of the issues that you described in your talk.
Absolutely. I really appreciate this question because I love paying attention to what subtitling practices are, especially when even sometimes when I don't know the language, right? I've written about the Malaysian filmmaker Yasmin Ahmad. She makes films that are wildly multilingual in languages that she didn't even speak when she was alive. And they're, 9 languages, and a Japanese filmmaker, subtitler, when it was translated into Japanese, used multicolored subtitles to refer to all the languages, right? And one thing that I appreciate, so it's on my DVD copy of The Road to Mandalay, this was not reflected, but when I first saw The Road to Mandalay at the LA Asian Pacific Film Festival, they used yellow subtitles when Thai was spoken and white subtitles when the Mandarin was spoken, because those are the 2 dominant languages in the film. And in both of these films, those are the kind of 2 dominant languages. And so I found that practice nice, right? To at least give some visual diversity, even if the the viewer doesn't know what the different language is that is being spoken. Of course, you know, there's always in subtitling, there's going to be things that are not captured, right? Like, I think saying "you're from the mountains" in the clip I showed is not capturing what he's actually saying, which is saying you're an ethnic minority, right? You're or indigenous minority. You belong to this hill tribe. This kind of, you know, primitivizing her identity, or you know, this kind of pejorative reference to the idea of Chao Kao, which may not always be used pejoratively, and it's possible that even the military official himself is Chao Kao, and that's how he knows so well about it in that clip. So there are things in the audioscape that aren't being captured. There's you know, sometimes there's background dialogue on the radio or television that is translated but not fully. So you know, there's definitely limits to that translation. Now, in terms of the how his films became known, it was very much through film festival circuits. But it's interesting in looking, you know, Professor Rush's question got to this too, in terms of the ways in which he kind of presents these films, or what they gain attention for at more Western or Anglophone oriented film festivals, as opposed to ones in the Chinese speaking sphere, where it really focuses. They assume that the Chinese and Taiwanese audiences are going to be interested in the idiosyncrasies of the diaspora, right? Of Sinophone communities and all the kind of different types of communities that there are, and the ingenuity of these communities in their immigrant locations and how they relate to Chineseness, right? But then in Anglophone context, the interest is often on censorship, on, you know, smuggling, on human trafficking, on these kind of these issues, and how, you know, the kind of covert nature of it, the guerrilla filmmaking style, right? So and he plays to that, right? When he's been interviewed at these film festivals. So so I think that's kind of the way he's gotten known, and he kind of bridges. These aren't totally separate. They cross paths for sure. But he also knows how to kind of manage that, and it seemed to then become his funding structure. So the Road to Mandalay, I believe, had some French funding for it. It also had some Taiwan funding. He's gotten funding from, I believe, from Thailand as well. So you know, and when you're making independent features that are not going to be commercially successful, his films are not going to, you know, at least as of now, are not going to be commercially, like, you know, successful given their content. You have to piecemeal together all these different funding sources to make a career out of it from the kind of art house film festival community. And so that's kind of what he's done.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Appreciate that. Thank you. Other questions? We're doing well on time. So if any, we certainly have time for one more question.
I saw a hand from Marina at the beginning. I don't know if their question was answered, but if
wonderful. Marina, do you have a let me allow you to talk. Marina, do you have a Marina is one of our interns here at the Center for Asian Research. Marina, did you have a question for Professor Bernards? Maybe not. Hello?
Maybe not. I'm sorry if I put them on the spot.
No, not at all.
Okay.
There's so many buttons, and I want to make sure I'm operating correctly.
Maybe I can say something if you don't mind my using that time. In that portrayal of the general thematic of you know, shifting identities and this migrating aspect of both individuals and who they are and how they define themselves in relation to their context. I'm also reminded of themes. I mean, it's a theme that occurs in other kinds of artistic productions. I'm thinking about Amitav Ghosh's latest novel of migrating, I think it's called Snake Island or something Island, where you know, illegal workers from Bangladesh are migrating to Venice, and he's describing this essentially global network of migration that is driven by, in his case, climate change and the causes that propel that. But what he describes is kind of a global network of that. And
Right.
I think what we see with Midi C's work is part of that larger network, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, and we tend to forget that it's not a location. I mean, it's a location simultaneously
Yes.
that
Yeah.
plays itself out, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. And a couple of scholars, well, there's Luke Robinson, who's based in the UK, has written, his focus was more on kind of how Midi Z leverages the kind of new Taiwan cinema paradigm, but is doing something different with it. And he calls it network aesthetics from below, right? You talked about network, and it's all about that dislocation and how it taps into maybe the emphasis isn't so much global, but kind of connecting to the theme of this lecture series is regional, right? And it has global flows and currents, but the arena in which it plays out and the sphere, and this is by aesthetics, it's not just like the storylines of these protagonists as migrants, it's what can be shown, right? Because when we're looking at it from the perspectives of these migrants, we can't look at it we can't be shown the macro global perspective of all the chain and flow of goods and all the the creation of textile factories and all of that, and who's running it, and it's going to be this kind of limited sphere in which the protagonists have only this kind of obstructed knowledge or view, and they know there's these dangers, but they have to kind of make these calculated risks, and they don't know what the larger socioeconomic forces are necessarily are. And in Poor Folk, one of the great scenes is where they're talking about and climate too. They're talking about the Bangkok floods in the background on the radio, and how that has hampered the tourist industry. And this explains why that character, Afu, who's the tour guide, they've gone back to Arunotai and are now trying to, refine this painkiller called Tiffy into a amphetamine. They don't know what they're doing. They have no idea what they're doing. They're just following kind of what's been told, but it explains why. It kind of gives a little bit of an explanation of why they had to go there, right? Because the tourism industry is down because of the flood. So there are not going to be tourists coming in 2011 at that time. And then of course, there's also the coup that that took Yingluck Shinawatra out of power as prime minister. And that is kind of also part of the backdrop that's hampering the tourist industry. But the protagonists don't know. So there's this slight kind of acknowledgement of the larger, at least national, maybe regional context. But of course, there are also the global forces of global capitalism, but he's showing this network aesthetics from below, right? And so I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're past 11 now, so maybe we'll take this opportunity to thank our speaker one more time. Professor Bernard, thank you so much for a wonderful talk, for taking time to speak with us today, and I hope very much we'll be able to welcome you out here in person sometime soon. We really enjoyed this, and just appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was such an honor and delight, and I really appreciate the very excellent questions that you all shared with me. And please feel free to email me if you want to follow up or have any references to share with me.
Thank you very much. We will, for sure.